Welcome back. Time to talk about industry and competitors and how we can think about how strategy for your business and your competitive advantage. So, let's get started. First of all, let's talk about what is strategy. So, here's two guys who work in the field of strategy, fairly well known among academics like myself. Michael Porter is a professor at Harvard, and Jay Barney is a professor at the University of Utah. And they both talked about strategy. First of all, what you're not seeing here is what strategy is not. So, strategy is not planning, strategy is not tactics. Strategy is the things that lead up to those things. So, tactics would follow from a strategy, for example. But Michael Porter suggests that perhaps strategy is what is the unique position that your firm holds. So within your industry, within your market, what is it that makes your firm unique, and how are you able to leverage that to form a strategy? And then I think this fits pretty well with Jay Barney's, which is what is your firm's theory of how you will be successful? So these work very well together. Uh, if you think about how your unique position can be a way to form a theory about how you will be successful, and to think about how your firm should be able to come up with a statement or two that would tell you about your strategy. So if we think of an example, let's think about Walmart. So Walmart's theory of how they would be successful would be to say, we believe that if we are the low cost leader in our industry, in our market, that's what will help us be successful. And you can think of all the tactics that follow that, such as uh, their pricing strategy, their advertising strategy, and a great example is their use of data. So Walmart is famously addicted to big data. They collect a lot of data, they crunch a lot of data, and the reason why they do that is because it helps them understand and realize their theory of how to become the low cost leader. And they believe that if they are able to do that, that their unique position in the market will help them be successful. So if we move on and talk a little bit more about what Porter was talking about positioning, unsurprisingly, he had more things to say about this. And this is a fairly famous model. Maybe you've seen it before, where Porter talks about how to think about position in a market. So he says there are five forces that act upon firms that firms need to deal with when they are in a market and an industry. So, first of all, let's talk about the difference between a market and an industry. So, a market is how you and firms like you are positioned among a group of customers. So, your market has to do with your customers. So, you're serving customers, and other firms are serving those same customers. If that's the case, you're in the same market. The the other thing to think about is your industry. So, an industry is you and the other firms that are serving that market. So, the focus here is on firms like you and your competitors. So, think about those two things, market and industry. So, in this diagram, you can see that the horizontal axis is really about market, and the vertical axis is really about industry. So let's start with market. So on the left, bargaining power of suppliers. What this means is that firms need to think about, to varying degrees, how much power the firms that they are buying things from have. So the focal point here is your firm and what kind of power suppliers in your market have on you. So let's think of some examples. So, what would be an example of low supplier power? So, an example of this might be any kind of commodity. So, if you are running, for example, a construction business, you're a contractor, and you need something like landscaping materials, gravel, let's say. So if you think about how much power does a supplier of gravel, maybe somebody owns a yard somewhere where they have stone, gravel, sand, other kind of aggregate materials like that for construction. So if you think about that, gravel is really gravel no matter where you look at it, right? There's really not a big difference between suppliers of gravel. And there's really not a lot of diversification within the gravel industry. So for that reason, it's pretty easy to buy your gravel from any supplier. And that means that any one gravel supplier doesn't have a whole lot of power over you as a firm. They don't have a lot of control over what you can do as a firm to dictate prices or choose from whom you're going to buy that gravel. On the other hand, you might think about firms like professional sports teams, where they're looking at, famously in the recent past, when the NFL referees went on strike. It turns out that those NFL referees are very difficult to replace. They had some embarrassing times for the NFL where they tried to hire replacement referees, and it was clear that the quality of those referees was not as good. And so that forced the NFL to come back to the bargaining table and listen to what the referees wanted. And those suppliers, the referees, were suppliers to the NFL. That was something where they had a lot more power. The same could be said of the players in those sports teams also. If they are providing something that those teams can't get anywhere else, they have a lot of power. If you look on the other side, the bargaining power of buyers, this is how much power do the customers that are buying things from you and other firms in your industry, what kind of power do those buyers have? So an example of buyers that might have high power, if your business is selling cars, if you run an auto dealership, your buyers have a lot of power. And the reason for this is, if you've ever bought a car from a car dealership, it's easy to go find another car dealership, right? If you are looking to buy a mid-size sedan, let's say, not only is it easy to leave a Honda dealership and go to a Toyota dealership, but it's actually pretty easy to go find another Honda dealership. So they don't have a whole lot of power over the Honda dealership or the car dealership. You as a car dealership don't have a lot of power. The buyers hold all the power in that situation. On the other hand, there might be a case where buyers have very low power. So if you are running, for example, say an Oktoberfest event, something like that, where you have people that have tickets, they have to buy them, they get in, and then when they're in there, you can charge them almost anything you want for beer, because the only choice they have is to leave the Oktoberfest and go somewhere else, which is difficult. Another perfect example of this really is utility suppliers. So if you are the electric company, it's very difficult for your buyers to dictate to you what they should pay for electricity. It's very difficult to switch. In fact, it's almost always impossible to switch to another utility. And this is protected by law, even, that you can do that you cannot switch. So that's an example of where buyers have a very low buying power. If we switch to the vertical axis now and talk about the industry, this is about how changes in the industry, changes in competitors, changes in firms, not having anything to do with customers, but having to do with other firms, how that affects the industry. So if we start at the top and think about the threat of new entrants, the other way to think about this, if there is a high threat of new entrants, it's because there are low barriers to entry, if you've heard of that. And vice versa. If there are high barriers to entry, then there's not much of a threat of new entrants. So if you think about a case where the threat of new entrants is very high, meaning that barriers to entry are low, you could think about something like opening a yoga studio. So all you really need to open a yoga studio is a place, a space to do yoga, and that's it, right? So it's not that difficult to open it one. It doesn't mean that you're going to be successful or that becoming a successful yoga studio is easy. It just means that starting one is easy. And if you think about the most extreme example of this, the easiest industry to enter, the industry where the threat of new entrants is highest, that would be, I'll give you an example. So if you close your eyes right now and just for a second imagine and say to yourself, I am a consultant. Congratulations, you just entered the consulting industry. So the threat of new entrants in the consulting industry is very high. The barriers to entering the consulting industry are very low. Does this mean that you'll be a successful consultant now that you've entered? It does not mean that. So there are big consulting companies, McKinsey, those kinds of companies. They're not worried about you entering, but it's not because they think it's hard to enter, right? It's because they think that they have high quality, that they have great experience, they have good reputation, but they know that anybody could enter at any time. Their strategy does not depend on high barriers to entry or thinking that the threat of new entrants is low. On the other hand, where are industries where the threat of new entrants is actually very low or the barriers to entry are very high? So a perfect example of this is the pharmaceutical industry, right? You can't enter the pharmaceutical industry without a drug, at least one drug. So to get a drug passed by the FDA and to make it possible to just sell your very first product, you have to have a lot of things. You need to have the drug itself, you need to have FDA approval, you need all kinds of things in order to actually even start your business. Another example would be something like creating a wind farm. So you can't start generating electricity via wind until you've set up a wind turbine. So that costs money. That's not easy to do, especially if you're going to create any kind of real amount of electricity. If we go down to the bottom and look at threat of substitutes, this is talking about not direct competitors in your industry, but other companies, products, and services that customers might use instead of yours. So if you think about this, it would not be, for example, two prescription drug companies, two pharmaceutical companies who have the same drug for cholesterol, let's say, right? So it's not two competing cholesterol drugs from different pharmaceutical companies. Instead, it might be, perhaps food products, diet-related kind of cholesterol controls might be a substitute. If those become very good, that might be difficult for pharmaceutical companies, right? It might cause a problem for them in their sales. It might be that those substitutes are a real threat. Excuse me. Where's another threat of substitutes that's very high? So cleaning products, right? Any kind of cleaning product could be substituted for another kind of cleaning product. You might use vinegar and water to clean windows instead of an ammonia-based product from Procter & Gamble. So I think you can see here where threat of substitutes comes in. You might have heard of some examples of this. For example, if you've ever heard that beer or wine, often they talk about wine as being recession-proof. Why do they say this? Well, it's because if financial times are tough, it may be difficult for some consumers to do things like go on a big vacation or spend a lot of time and money going to expensive restaurants. But you could go to your local grocery store and see a nice bottle of wine and say, we can't afford to go on vacation, but we can enjoy this nice bottle of wine at home. So that is a threat of a substitute. And in the middle is the last piece, which is rivalry among existing competitors. The quintessential example of this is Coke versus Pepsi. We see the same thing in airlines, and we see the same thing in smartphones, right? So Android versus Apple. And it just says, for example, in the Coke versus Pepsi example, what we're talking about here is in some industries like soft drinks, competitors do things because of what other competitors are doing. So if you've ever seen cherry, lemon, crystal Pepsi, there's a cherry, lemon, crystal Coke, right? And the reason why is because they're watching each other and responding to each other. To a certain extent, that happens in every industry, but in some industries like soft drinks, airlines, smartphones, you can see that it's driven by rivalry, and that's a big factor. So what's the point of all this? Well, the point is that you need to understand what these forces are in the industry and market that you are competing in, and understand how they might affect you and your competitors. And if you're able to do that, you may be able to understand how your position in the market can affect your strategy. So what can you do with that? Well, there's basically two overarching strategies that have to do with positioning. So you can either be cheap, that's known as cost leadership, and we talked about Walmart earlier, that's a perfect example, or you can be different, that's a differentiation strategy. So any kind of niche product, that would be the case. Any kind of premium product, that would be the case. Any kind of product that differentiates itself from others because of features or a piece of its value proposition that is about being different, that would be the case. So it's very difficult to do both of these things at the same time. And so these are kind of independent strategies. But you should think about to what extent your position in your market and industry help you do one or the other of these and what's most important to you. So this is coming back to Jay Barney, and this is part of the article that you read. The other thing you can think about is, besides positioning, the other big one is resources. So maybe it's about not just the position that you are in a market, but what kind of resources you have available to you. But of course, the point is everybody has some resources. If you think about everything that you have, everything that you might have access to, those are all resources. And they're not always strategic, but some are. So an example would be every business has a bathroom, right? Everybody has access to a restroom, to running water, those kinds of things. But that's a resource that you have, but it's not a competitive resource. It doesn't help you have a strategic advantage. So how do you decide which resources are strategic and can help you in that way? So Jay Barney says, think about these four things. Think about whether a resource is valuable. That's pretty self-explanatory. Whether a resource is rare, if it's hard to have, if there's a lot of it or not much of it. If it is inimitable, meaning is it difficult to copy or imitate? And non-substitutable, are there other resources that could be used in its place or not? So I'll give you an example very quickly of each. So valuable, an obvious example here would be cash. So famously, Apple is the most cash-rich company on the planet right now. And they can do a lot of things with that cash, right? They can buy all of the microchips needed for all of the iPhones that are out there and control that market. They can launch new products and go into big R&D kind of investments. There's a lot of things they can do with that because that cash is valuable. The example of a rare resource would be something like diamonds. So it turns out that most of the diamonds in the world are owned and sold by the De Beers company. So they have control over those, and so therefore, not only are diamonds just rare in the wild, but they're rare in the market because they're controlled primarily by one company. So because of that, the De Beers Company has a strategic advantage because of that rare resource. Inimitable, an example here might be something like company culture. So if you look at a company like Google, they're famous for having sort of a unique company culture with free food and table tennis and slides and taking one day of the week to work on one's own projects. And if you talk to people, there have been books written about Google's culture, and because it's been sort of an organic kind of growth of this culture over time, people at Google would say it's very difficult for us to even know how we would recreate that culture from scratch. So that's Jay Barney would say that's the most complete example of something being inimitable is if the company that has that resource doesn't even know how to do it, how they do it, that it's very inanimate. It's very hard to copy. The last one, non-substitutable. So something like having a patented technology to do some kind of process. That could be very difficult to substitute, and if a company has that, that can be very valuable to them in a strategic sense. And in some cases, companies have all of these things. So Steve Jobs is a perfect example of a human resource for the company Apple. He was of great value to the company. He is now extremely rare. Sadly, we have 0 Steve Jobs left in the world, but only one of him. It'd be very difficult for other companies to try to just find a copy of Steve Jobs, someone who is just like Steve Jobs, so difficult to imitate. And the things that Steve Jobs did for Apple have proved to be very hard to substitute. Tim Cook's a very fine CEO, and the company is doing well, but some would argue he's not a great substitute for Steve Jobs, or not a perfect substitute in any case. So if you think of any resource that your company might have, if it is at least one of these things, if it fits one of these categories, it might be a competitive and strategic resource. If it fits all of them, it almost certainly is. So what to do from here? We're looking forward to your MOA presentation. All of the orange numbers that you see here, the problem, the solution, the customers you're targeting it toward, unique value proposition, we've spent a lot of time on these. To think about what your unfair advantage is, think about all these strategic questions, right? And how your strategy might differ from competitors and substitutes that are out there in the same industry and market. So it's really that box number 5 that we're looking to fill in here. Here's how I would suggest you do that. Try these 2 things. First, do a competitive analysis. Think about who the competitors are that matter most to your business, maybe substitutes also. And then what can your team do to develop a sustainable competitive advantage in the presence of those competitors? So think about the resources you have and the position you have in your market and your industry. And I would say this should take you about 30 minutes as a team to do, and you can come up with a pretty good list of who your competitors are and how you stack up against them and why you might be able to compete, even though you're a new firm. Second thing I would do is update your lean canvas. So look at the entire canvas, update it, and put in your competitive analysis. That's mostly going to fit into that new box that we were just talking about. But go through your whole canvas and look at the assumptions that you have there and the things that worry you most in terms of what you're doing compared to your competitors and how you might improve your strategy. So plan what you're going to do with this and push your project forward for the MOA presentation. That is what's coming up next time, and I'll provide you with more details on how we're going to do that in an online fashion very soon. So get out there, think about your strategy, think about your competitors, think about your position in the market and the resources you have. and how that can be a sustainable competitive advantage for you and your team. All right, I'll talk to you guys next time.